Leaders oftentimes think about the incremental innovation as a way to solve for the gaps they have in their P&Ls, or how they're going to achieve their growth numbers. And oftentimes they miss much bigger risk, which is around their business being disrupted by new players, by new consumer behaviors.
When you're doing innovation, you're actually creating these varieties of directions that the company could go in. And in no other way is that really as overt as that, as an innovation.
The first one, like you said, is psychological safety. And that's really coming from the top. So the senior leadership team has to exhibit the behaviors that make the innovation team comfortable with the fact that they are going to fail. Every time something is going not according to plan, it's an opportunity to learn and get better every single time. So I would say the psychological safety is a really important one.
Welcome to Faces of Innovation. I'm so excited to be here today with Alice Ponti, a corporate innovation expert with over 20 years of experience, mostly working in CPG in companies like Diageo, L'Oreal, and AB InBev. Currently, she's the SVP of Strategy and Innovation at Venture Fuel. Welcome, Alice. So good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we'd kick it off with a discussion about risk generally. In my life, I think I've taken quite a lot of risks living in Europe for 12 years and jumping from jobs and countries. And it's been a lot of zigging and zagging. And I feel like I've really enjoyed these adventures, but I've also feel like when I look back on it, wow, some of them were really risky. But in the end, I don't regret any of them. And I think it was absolutely the right decision. So I kind of think to myself, it's not really a surprise that I ended up in a profession where risk is really a very important component of what we do as corporate innovators. So over to you. I wanted to hear a little bit about your perceptions and experience with the idea of risk.
Yeah, I would say, I share the same personal experience in the sense that similarly to you, I grew up in the south of France. I started studying marketing and market research in Paris. And then I moved to London for 10 years. So I got to hop from one country to the next. And then eventually got an expat contract with AB InBev to move to the US. So that was another really big step. And I also moved in my career from market research to marketing to innovation. So really experienced a few changes along the way. And I would say, for me, I've always seen taking calculated risks, let's say, as a way of growing as an individual. And if I look back, similarly to you, I think that all the changes and the steps that I've taken have really led me to be a better person, a better citizen, a better spouse, a better friend, because I've got to experience the world in the broadest possible sense. And I've got to learn about different jobs and different companies and all of that through taking, let's say, calculated risks throughout the way. And I would say the parallel is very much there when it comes to innovation and corporate innovation in particular, in that it is all about taking risks, but it's about doing it in an intelligent fashion. It's about measuring and mitigating the risk so that the payoff is greater than the potential downside.
Yes, I really like this term intelligent risk, and we're going to get into what that really entails a little bit later. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about companies and how they handle risk. My first observation about it has always been that we all know this is a really risky activity. The people who work in it, our managers, their managers, it's in every single innovation book. But at the same time, I do think that sometimes at the very top, innovation and its risks are considered somehow riskier than the risks of the core business. So I always wondered these statistics, like 90% of projects don't get to market, and the same with startups that are always, there's a lot of failure there. It still somehow doesn't come up, I think, in discussions when we're planning projects and budgets and all of that. So I'm curious about your experience with that. Why is this kind of like, it is the elephant in the room a lot, but it's also kind of not discussed as much in these roles that we've had.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. I think I have a personal hypothesis that it's less that it's a secret or something that people are not aware of. It's more something that people don't want to face. And I would kind of classify it as it's a little bit of a case of collective amnesia, in the sense that everyone knows there's a high risk involved in innovation, yet particularly leadership typically expects that we're going to be more successful. We're going to have better odds than what we've heard. We're going to be able to convert to more successful innovation projects. So, and I think it's a little bit as well of a tendency to want to drive teams towards a shared goal. And it's somewhat maybe seen as demotivating, or it's not the way to galvanize energy and excitement around the project. If you're, from the get-go, you're publicizing, I'm well aware that this thing might not go anywhere, but it is what it is. Let's just give it a go. I think there's a bit of a natural human tendency to go, I need to put a brave face and a positive face, and, we're going to give it our best shot. And, I'm expecting the team is going to do its best, and therefore we might beat those odds is I think what's happening.
Yeah, that is a very powerful thing to kind of instill that belief in teams. And I always wonder about this distinction between risk in the core business and risk in innovation. It feels like there's a lot of risk in a core business, but somehow the risk in innovation is greater. And because the core business runs like a machine, usually people don't really think about the isolated pieces of risk that are happening, especially from external events, which can dramatically change, as we saw during COVID, what the risk potential is. So I wonder why just so much focus on innovation risk when risk is the part of doing business, really.
That's an interesting one, and I would argue that you're right. Leaders oftentimes think about the incremental innovation as a way to solve for the gaps they have in their P&Ls, or how they're going to achieve their growth numbers, and oftentimes they miss the much bigger risk, which is around their business being disrupted by new players, by new consumer behaviors, by drastic shifts in what's happening in society. And that often doesn't get tackled. And sometimes innovation projects get to work at the frontier of those big disruptive forces, but it's not allowed to be considered as potentially the solution to help a company disrupt itself and protect itself and future-proof itself. So it's an interesting thought that there's actually a greater risk in not tackling your core business and future-proofing that than there is in launching innovation on the side, whether that's product line extension or even venturing into different spaces, different categories, or even looking at new business models for that matter.
Yes. The question of what happens if we don't do this comes up occasionally in the room. And I love this quote that Rita McGrath always talks about from Columbia University. She says that innovation is the option to create value in the future, option value. So when you're doing innovation, you're actually creating these varieties of directions that the company could go in. And in no other way is that really as overt as an innovation, that you're the optionality, I guess. And so that kind of idea of optionality is really interesting when you couple it with this idea of like, what happens if we don't do this? So I just getting it a little bit into the nitty gritty of what we have with the appetite for risk. I think I'd like to talk briefly about StageGate with you, because that is been, it's something that's been around for all of us for a very long time. I've worked in 2 companies that have them. And it's interesting because now as an advisor, I see the same types of StageGate processes that I saw 10 years ago. And I do kind of wonder whether it's keeping up with the pace of corporate innovation, the kind of processes that we use, because it feels like it's kind of stuck in the past, just the heaviness of it and the amount of time that it takes.
Yeah.
But maybe we should just start off with explaining a little bit about what StageGate is. I'll let you do that, Alice.
All right. So I will come out first. I love StageGate.
Okay.
So StageGate is essentially really a decision-making process that allows innovation teams and senior leaders and cross-functional teams to manage the commercialization of innovation projects in a way that is measured, disciplined, and robust. And essentially, the way it works is you have certain milestones or certain gates where you have to provide, as a project innovation team, you have to provide evidence of the progress you've made on the project, and then you get an official sign-off to move to the next gate. So the first one is going to be about the value proposition and the consumer need, and really cracking is there an actual problem I'm solving? Is it big enough to solve for? Is it worthwhile our company's time and resources? Then you go into, I think I have a value proposition that's defined. I have some consumers that are interested in this proposition. I think it meets the needs that we've unearthed. So can we move to the next step? And then you go into, I have a prototype or a working product that is ready to go. Here is the P&L. Here is how much money we're going to make of it. Are we ready to go into a pilot or a launch? It's a great process to minimize the amount of risk when you're commercializing an innovation that is the bread and butter of your organization. So let's say for AB InBev, Anheuser-Busch InBev, it could be we're launching a new flavor of Bud Light, or we're launching a new flavor, a new cocktail, undercut water. So you're essentially, really, you know exactly how to do it. Everyone who's involved knows exactly how to do it, but this is about catching any potential risk that something may go awry. So whether that's we're sourcing a flavor from a supplier that's about to go bankrupt, that should show up in the StageGate process, or actually the cost of the flavor has increased tremendously over the last 6 months, so we might have to take that into consideration in the P&L. That's a risk that you can mitigate. Or the way we're communicating about this product is not clearly understood by consumers, so we're going to have to design a new packaging, let's say. Those are all things that can be managed through StageGate and get managed very well. And when I was at AB InBev leading global beer innovation, I was in charge of running the StageGate process for the whole of the globe when it came to mainstream beer brands. So I would have the say on, yes, we can progress a project, whether that's in South Africa, in Korea, in Colombia, in Brazil. And for that, it's great. When it comes to breakthrough innovation, where you need to really iterate on a proposition, on the problem, on the consumer, on everything, essentially, StageGate is not great, because StageGate is a very structured, inflexible process where you have to abide by the rules, you have to complete certain activities, and then you get your sign-off to move to the next gate. And this is not really conducive of what you need when you're trying to tackle creating a new product category or looking at a new business model, and where you really have to tinker along the edges, you're really having to stress test things, you're really having to recreate things on a regular basis, and it just does not allow for that iteration. So I would say I love StageGate for when it's about commercializing something that's really within the core of the machine, and you could call it Horizon 1 type innovation. But it is not the right process when it comes to breakthrough innovation. And in fact, when I was at AB InBev, we had a process that would go before StageGate starts, which would be all about exploring, which would be all about being more entrepreneurial and doing some more test and learn, essentially the lean startup / scale up process. But the reality was nobody was following that process because we had so few of these types of breakthrough innovation projects. So I would say we still need to create the right governance, create the right decision-making processes so that we support our teams in making the right decisions in a intelligent, risk-taking fashion. But StageGate is not the answer, unfortunately.
Yes, I agree. And I'm curious whether you were evolving those metrics along the way in the StageGate process for those Horizon One innovations. Mm-hmm. What kinds of hurdles did projects need to go through in order to move on to the next step? Because I think every company is completely different, and what tests need to be scored at what level, and obviously the product tests are completely different from the concept tests. And so it's actually, I think, quite a significant part of the work that we do if you work in Horizon One innovation. And yet it's very specific to the category, specific to the company, and often is kind of the same thing that we did 10 years ago, kind of. So that's what I'm curious about, is how are those metrics established in the companies that you've worked in? Because I'm actually not aware how those metrics were established in the companies that I've worked in.
Yeah, I would say it's a bit of a combination of, there's a mix of internal metrics that are related to the P&L and the performance KPIs that we want to see through the life cycle of the innovation project. But a lot of times it's related to the research agency, internal, external, that's in charge of testing and validating concepts, products, full mix, everything. So if I think about my experience, whether that's Unilever, L'Oréal, Danone, Diageo, AB InBev, there is usually, like, the first gate is going to be about concept validation, and it's really making sure that you have a breadth of consumer appeal amongst your consumer audience, your consumer target, and that you're outperforming, let's say, comparative benchmarks within the industry. So that would be the first step. That shows you promise that the concept is garnering enough interest, the purchase intent is looking good, and you have something that's worthy of progressing. But then you go into the actual product testing. In my case, because I've worked in food and beverage quite a bit, it's actually you getting people to try the product. And so there is a battery of KPIs around, is the taste appealing? Is it hitting the right balance of sweet and acid? And is it actually tasting as advertised? Does it actually taste of strawberry? if it's a strawberry flavored thing. So you're looking at, is the overall performance of the product in line with the expectations we're setting with the concept and the packaging? You're testing the packaging as well. Is it standing out on shelf? Is it easy to read? Is it legible? Is it attracting people's eyes?
And claims, you almost forgot.
Do you have the right claims? Are they conveying the right, are they setting the right expectations? So you're testing that. And then you're testing the full mix and the communication with it. And it's about, is the product meeting the expectations set by the concepts and the packaging? And do I want to buy it? And will I want to buy it again? And when would I want to buy it? For what occasions? And all of that. So those are very similar KPIs that are set. And I've seen that across many different industries and companies. It really depends on, are you working with Basis? Are you working with your internal insights team to run those tests? Are you working with another agency and therefore setting different KPIs? I would say incrementality is another really big one. So it can be complex to measure, but is this new innovation going to offer net new sales that were not there before and not going to cannibalize my existing brand sales and my expanded portfolio sales? We're looking at that. We're looking at incrementality to the category. am I able to recruit new consumers, new shoppers into the category by virtue of launching these new products? So I would say those are some of the key KPIs. But you're right, they haven't really changed over the years. I mean, if I think about 20 years ago when I was in L'Oréal, and now more recently, we're still talking about the same
things and the same tests.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's time for a rethink.
Maybe it is.
I think one of my experiences at PepsiCo that was really interesting was that we went through all of those tests and everything seemed to be, scoring super well. And there was lots of expectation for a new beverage that we launched, and it flopped. And the reason why it flopped is because it was distributed through the wrong channel. And so what's really interesting is that you can check all of these different tests, like we just ran through, like 25 different tests, and you don't even just do them once. You do them iteratively, repeatedly, and then all of them together, and things can still go south, even for unexpected reasons like that, like, oh, you launched it in the wrong type of retailer. So, I mean, when you talk about risk, it's like you're going through all of these motions where you think, okay, if it scores well on this, if it scores well on this, if it scores well on this, but I think it reminds you of the humility of the work that you could do all you can. And then there's also that whole discussion about market research. When someone's telling you something, they may just be telling you what they think you want to hear, versus some of the newer testing models, which are all about experimentation and really using social to try and get a more accurate read of what people actually are going to click on and therefore add to their basket, et cetera, et cetera. But I think some of those are used a lot, as you said, in the breakthrough innovation type of approach, which can go on for a very long time before you actually do any of that gating, because you sometimes really have to go back to the drawing board numerous times in that kind of unstructured way that you described. But in a way, I felt like that was a freedom to be able to work without all of those checkpoints that you were describing in the traditional StageGate process, because yourself if, for example, an early type of in-depth interviews with consumers, if that doesn't go well, okay, it's you shouldn't really be proceeding. So let's talk a little bit about how these different projects are managed in a holistic way, the risk management that's involved in that, because the most sophisticated companies that I've worked with really think about that portfolio approach, and they use, to a certain extent, that whole 70% breakthrough, 20% adjacent, 10% blue sky, or whatever you want to call it, Horizon 3. But that's just a sort of guideline. It's not anything that's really set in stone, because of course different companies have different appetites for that kind of thing at different times of their business, really, and different years mean different things. So I'm curious, tell me a little bit about, Alice, your experience with portfolio planning and portfolio analysis, and how often it changes at the places that you've worked.
I can give the example of, so the most recent example was with AB InBev, and essentially this was on the back of, we had developed a new demand landscape for the US. So this was a view of the consumer occasions, the consumer segments, and essentially the needs that underpin all of those, that gave us a view of some potential pockets of growth. And so what we did is we overlaid our existing portfolio on this demand landscape, and it helped us to identify some potential gaps to close. And this was across all categories of beverages, so from beer to non-alc beers to hard seltzers to cocktails and so on and so forth. And so my role and the role of the innovation team was then to really build an innovation pipeline that would serve the need of all of those gaps in the portfolio picture. So really taking it from a true portfolio management perspective, whilst also working closely with the brand teams to make sure that they have the types of innovations that they need on their brands in order to continue to fuel the growth on those brands and future-proof those brands. And so what that led us to do was we created a number of new brands, a number of new product categories to some extent as well. And this was very much with the thought of how do we make sure we have the number one or the number two player in each of the subcategories across all of the different spaces in beverages that we want to play in. And so that was quite a big effort, but which concluded, after a couple of years of building new brands. Some of them are partnerships with existing brands. Some of them are entirely new brands. But that was how we tackled the portfolio management piece.
So you really looked at every demand space that was within kind of currently or predicted also in the next 2 or 3 years, and then filled in those gaps. Wow, that's a really interesting way to do it.
Yes.
And so you just kicked off projects immediately once you learned, okay, this is, for example, non-alcoholic. We all know that's a huge thing. Suddenly you just kicked off new efforts to try and enter those kind of spaces if you weren't in them already.
So I would say we didn't kick off efforts immediately. We had really thorough conversations with our senior leadership team on what are the spaces that we actually want to prioritize, because there were a few gaps on the map, and some of them we decided not to do anything about. Some of them we did decide that we had to create new brands. And I would say to that point, what was really important, an important addition in terms of managing the risk, back to today's theme, was to have really intelligent conversations with our senior executive leadership team on what does our innovation strategy need to look like, and what are we doing now versus what are we doing in the future, and how are we mitigating the risks of creating new brands, creating new categories. And I would say a big shift that we made at that time was to really embrace piloting, seeding in market. So for each of the new brands that we have in plan, there's a strong pilot plan in place with whether that's a particular region or state or retailer that we partner with, so that we can really stress test in the real world, do we have the right product proposition? Does it address the consumer need we've identified? Does it need to be optimized before we scale it? So that was a really critical way for us to do the portfolio management piece, but do it in a way that's with a measured approach to risk taking.
Mm-hmm. And how long will those new brands be in the portfolio before they get kind of reviewed, and what's the measure of success, I guess, that's expected from all those new brands?
So typically when we pilot new brand, I'm saying I'm no longer with the company, but when AB InBev is piloting those brands, it's at the very least 6 months in market, if not 9 to 12 months, to make sure that we have a good read not only on actual purchase, but also repeat purchase. So we want to make sure that we see those cycles of consumption, and that we're able to really monitor rate of sale and see whether it's influenced by the efforts we put into securing the distribution in the first instance, or it's then going down, or if it's plateauing, or is it actually going up? Consumers' traction with the innovation is actually picking up. So we want to give it a good amount of time in the seed phase, and that could be 12 months, or that could be even longer if we have to iterate, optimize, whether that's the product proposition itself or the way we're communicating about the product. Then it really has to pass a few tests. So obviously there's going to be some volume expectations, even though this is not the qualifying KPI, but as a ballpark, we're expecting a certain volume. We're expecting a rate of sale, which needs to be in what we call the growth corridor. So it has to be in line with the best performing competitors within this particular category, so that we're holding ourselves accountable on, is it selling, like is the rotation good enough that it justifies to have the product listed in place of another product. So rate of sale is very important, and the trajectory of the rate of sale. Like I said, repeat rates is incredibly important. We look at variations of NPS, so level of satisfaction of not just the consumer but also the wholesalers and the retailers. Would they recommend it to their peers, and expand therefore the distribution to other retailers? And then eventually, as things are starting to scale up a little bit more, we're looking at profitability. We want to make sure that ultimately we're able to have the right levels of margin that satisfy our sellers, our distributors' expectations, as well as ours when it comes to profit.
That's incredible that you get all of that also from the pilot. That's sophisticated risk management, is this idea of just piloting in one market or a couple of markets before launching much bigger. I want to make sure to take the time to talk about your current role, Alice, because it's a really interesting dimension of risk management in companies with the work that you're doing at Venture Fuel. So I've heard a little bit about it, but let's just really get into that before we get to our last topic. Tell me a little bit about the focus at Venture Fuel and what kind of work you're doing there.
Yeah, of course. So Venture Fuel is an independent innovation advisory firm. And what we do is we support the world's best organization in accelerating innovation and R&D, but we do it specifically through connecting them with our ecosystem of startups and VCs. And so my role specifically as SVP of Innovation and Strategy is to support our CPG clients in igniting growth and accelerating the commercialization of innovation. So I'll just give you a few examples of some of the things that we do. We work with R&D experts to really help them to accelerate product development, for instance, by tapping into new technologies that startups have that can help them to, whether that's run their lines more efficiently, run their production lines more efficiently, or add new textures and new flavors, or leverage fermentation as a way of creating new products that get to new functional claims. So we work in the field of product development with food and bev clients. We work in material science as well. We work with large corporations around Gen AI as well. We actually run the world's largest AI accelerator in the world. So with Comcast, and we got to vet about 3,000 startups through this process over the last few years or so. So we work around a variety of technologies, business areas and challenges, and clients and industries.
So how does that tie back to risk management?
So it's actually very related in that what we do is we help those large organizations to de-risk their whole innovation process, because they're able to tap into the expertise of external entities like startups that have really gone very deep into the specific challenge that they're facing. And so it saves them time, because they don't have to develop and commercialize solutions themselves. And in some cases, they might not want to commercialize those solutions themselves. So there are fields that they recognize are just outside of their core competencies and capabilities. And so they really appreciate to have this external viewpoint of startups that have a solution that they can either use as plug and play within the organization, or we also do what we call co-development, which is when we take a startup solution and we work with the client to tweak it so that it perfectly meets the need of our client. And that, again, really drastically accelerates the innovation process, because you don't have this whole phase of
internal development, right,
securing the funds to get to the solution, prototyping, and all of that. You're actually getting to a point where you're able to pilot pretty much straight away. And so, typically, just to give you an example, for large clients projects, we go from the initial sourcing of the startups based on the brief and the business challenge that the client is facing, then we are, vetting the startups really carefully, stress testing that they have the right solution, but also they have the right fit with the client in terms of personalities, in terms of like ways of working, communication, all of that. That is a very fast process that can go in around 2 to 3 months at the most. And then we can go into the pilot phase where we are testing a new solution in partnership with the startup and the clients, and whether that's implementing it into the enterprise itself or whether that's consumer-facing, customer-facing. But we found that it really helps to jump a few of the hoops when it comes to an innovation process. And again, it de-risks it because you have already more than an MVP when you're working with a startup. We are very carefully selecting startups that are enterprise ready. So they have already received a significant amount of funding. They have already had, they've generated revenues through their solution. So they are already proven to some extent, but they need more learnings maybe on a certain application, or they need other logos on their website page, and they value the partnership with us, Venture Fuel, but also with the clients.
Do you source those startups once you have the corporate clients challenge? So you do the scouting, and so it's not like you have this roster of partners, or you do also have a roster of partners?
So we do have a global innovation network that's made up of now thousands of startups around the world and VCs, and we can tap into this network. But it's really more a network of senior matter. So it's really a network of subject matter experts. So we're really tapping into that network first to really help us contextualize the business challenge and the ask from the client, so that we can really get to the best brief on what is the sourcing going to look like. But yes, the sourcing exercise is bespoke to every single client and every single brief. So whenever we get a new brief, we are scouring the conferences and websites and PitchBook and Crunchbase and our network and all of that to get to the best possible startups. And then we go through a very thorough vetting process where we really analyze and spend time with those startups to make sure that, again, they are enterprise ready.
So one last question on that. Is your client normally in R&D or marketing or corporate strategy? Or I'm just interested where the people are that are driving this agenda on the corporate side.
It's actually across all of the functions that you mentioned. So we work as much with R&D specialists in developing new material science technologies, as we work with heads of strategy who are tasked with building the growth strategy for the business, and therefore are seeing this new way of driving and accelerating innovation as a really credible path forward. So we work across many types of functions, and I think generally the common theme is that they've all come to the realization that in order for them to ignite change, whatever that means, or drive growth, they have to start looking out of their walls.
Right. And sometimes out of their industry in a way, to unexpected places.
Absolutely. I think the secret sauce of Venture Fuel as well is in making the connections that between industries and technologies that may not have anything to do with each other on the first glance, but actually when you dig deeper, you realize that they are, and this is the nature of innovation, right? Innovation is born out of connecting things that don't necessarily come together, anyway, yes.
So you're definitely going to go down a lot of very deep rabbit holes with a lot of different topics. That makes me really excited. I wanted to talk about the culture of risk-taking, because that is really what it all comes down to, in my opinion. It's often overlooked. I think people who do these jobs often work in these environments where it's just taken for granted that you as the innovation person are going to be able to display that kind of risk appetite. My experience has been that the way to a really good culture that embraces risk first starts with leadership and people role modeling that and showing it in terms of embracing failure, learnings, and really thinking in those terms of learnings and growth versus immediate success. The second thing I found is that psychological safety is really important because it's a job, unlike in a startup, it's a job with a paycheck. And I think that people, even instinctively, are afraid they're going to lose their job for all sorts of reasons. So it needs, I think, to be very intentionally ingrained into the culture and not just on a sign on the wall. What's been your experience with culture and how to really enable and empower people to feel that they actually can take risks and they can have points of views that are controversial and they can, at times, actually, as you said before, have the ability to disrupt the current core business and know that in the end it could be in the best interests of their company.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that come to mind about culture. The first one, like you said, is psychological safety. So, and that's really coming from the top. So the senior leadership team has to exhibit the behaviors that make the innovation team comfortable with the fact that they are going to fail. Inevitably, they are going to fail. And the leaders have to reframe failures with learnings. Every time something is going not according to plan, it's an opportunity to learn and get better every single time. So I would say the psychological safety is a really important one. The other piece that we've experimented with in my past roles is really to instill that notion of the founder mindset. So essentially, for our teams of corporate innovators or entrepreneurs, it's really giving them the sense of empowerment that they can act like a founder would if they were to create their own business within our business. So it's really, taking the decisions that they need to be taking in a timely fashion because they know best than anyone else what needs to happen on their project. It's really thinking about everything that could go wrong because invariably a lot of things are going to go wrong without having to be nudged or asked to do it. It's, taking the leadership to go above and beyond and really understand how the competition is behaving and how to make sure that our product is superior, our packaging is superior, our brand is superior. So it's really instilling that mindset that everything is within their hands. Like everything, they are able to shape everything in the way that they think they have to shape it. There's a huge latitude of decision making, and there's a huge amount of independence in those types of roles. So I would say psychological safety, founder mindset, and then one thing that we've experimented over the years that has been really successful for us. I'm talking about Anheuser-Busch InBev is it's called the Growth Board. And essentially what it is very strategic meetings with the full senior leadership team on innovation we did it on a quarterly basis, but we had 3 hours with our US leadership team or our global leadership team as well in the past, where we really go deep into the innovation strategy, the innovation pipeline, the projects, where we're at, and really guide them through the conversation so that they can make those informed decisions, they can take those intelligent risks. And I think one thing that we used that was really particularly powerful is we had an external partner that joined for some of those growth boards. So actually for the global growth boards, we had someone from was at P&G previously, Carl Ron. He created Swiffer and a number of other innovations. And the great thing with Carl was that, he really had the ear of our CEO and our CMO. So he was able to really instill the key thoughts and the key messages that we really needed to land in the right way. He was able to coach us before those big growth board meetings so that we would use the language that our senior leadership is expecting of us, and really convey the key messages or drive the decisions in a way that was really effective. And he was able to guide the discussion as well in the room with those senior leaders, where he would help us to steer the conversation and plant the seeds whenever was needed, so that we would have the senior leadership support. And I think that made a tremendous difference, because as much as the senior leaders in innovation can influence their senior leadership, you oftentimes need someone who has that external viewpoint, who is really able to provide the perspective from, in this case, P&G's innovation days. In those really high-stakes meetings, you want someone that can help you with what are the key messages to land, how am I going to, be able to influence positively my senior leaders, bringing the right types of examples or the right types of evidence in market. And so he was really able to coach us on that and to steer the conversation so that we would have really effective, productive conversations.
One thing I've noticed that was really helpful in my experience for that was the other side of the table, which is to have someone coaching the executives about how to ask the right questions. Because I think that piece often gets left out, and they, especially with early stage innovation, they often don't know what questions really are suitable at which times of the process. And so I'm sure that person probably also set the stage for those individuals. This is where these projects are. This is the mindset to have in the meeting, that, open-ended questions that are constructive and not focusing immediately on the business case. I think that's what becomes challenging, is the sequencing of how innovations come to life, and not to kill them too early with questions that are so data-driven before you've even come up with a value proposition or the real idea, actually.
No, absolutely. I mean, you and I worked together on this as well for the European team at Anheuser-Busch InBev, and I think Bionic and Greg Brody, I know that you had him in a past episode.
Yes.
Have really helped us actually for our Global Growth Board to do that, which is really to coach our senior leaders on what are the right questions to ask at different stages of the life cycle of an innovation project. Like, for instance, don't ask about the minute details of the P&L or how the cost of goods are going to look like when you have an innovator that's presenting to you the first draft of a concept. It's too early. But you want to understand at that point, who's the consumer target, like what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and how do you think the concept is delivering against that? So it's coaching them on the right questions at the right time, so that they're modeling those behaviors that innovators need to pick up on. And that's creating, again, that sense of psychological safety of, I'm not going to be asked of questions that I'm not going to be prepared to answer at this stage of the project. I'm going to be asked the right questions. And that is really critical. That is really critical.
Yes, the sequencing, basically. Exactly. One of the things Greg Brody always talks about also is that there's this objective of de-risking something as quickly as possible, so that you don't spend time working on something that just makes no sense at all. So there is this sort of speed with which you need, for example, in those breakthrough projects we were talking about earlier, or venture creation, where you're almost racing to get to the point of maybe this won't work while you're trying to make it work, so that you're maximizing budget, but also everyone's time. So, because you don't want to be working on something for a year and then find out it's not working. So it's kind of an interesting paradox.
Yeah.
My last question is really about the world beyond the innovation team and this idea of encouraging people to be more risk-taking with their work. And I've seen that be a little contagious in the organization once people start to see how innovation folks work and the kind of methodical way that we approach testing and more testing and learning and more testing. And I wondered if you had also seen people, that the culture enables people to become more risk-taking when they actually see innovations come to life.
It's an interesting one. I think what I've certainly seen is that the energy that innovators bring to the table is really infectious. Whether that's a hackathon or some form of pitch day event where everyone gets to participate. And so those are some of the most energized, engaging events there is in the corporate world. And I've certainly seen how the way we innovators experiment on a daily basis is something that's also contagious. It's also really empowered other teams and other functions to try things out, whether that's a new tool or a new vendor or a new way of approaching a project. And so I often found that innovation teams are picking up trends, let's say, in the corporate world where you see the same patterns or the same behaviors or the same tools being adopted across the whole of the organization. I mean, I think Gen AI is a good example right now where I've seen a lot of innovation teams tinker with Gen AI a lot sooner than other functions in the organization. And I think that, again, that's a testament of just our natural appetite for risk-taking, trying things out, and learning along the way.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to pause. Thank you so much, Alice, for being on the show today. It's been really great talking to you.
Thanks for having me.